In the shadows of 1960s London, two names struck fear into the hearts of both criminals and civilians alike: Ronald and Reginald Kray. These identical twins did not just rule the East End's criminal underworld. They transformed it into a theatrical empire where violence danced with celebrity, where brutality wore tailored suits, and where the line between criminal and celebrity blurred beyond recognition. Before we dive into this incredible true story, I am curious. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? Are you winding down for sleep or perhaps starting your day? If you enjoy these deep dive crime stories told in a relaxing way, hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like if you are ready for a captivating journey through London's criminal underworld. And do not forget to share this with anyone who loves true crime stories. Get comfortable, we are going on a journey together. One that will take us through the rise and fall of Britain's most notorious criminal twins. This is a story of contradictions, men who are simultaneously brutal killers and charming hosts. Business-minded entrepreneurs and psychotic criminals, devoted brothers and dangerous enemies. The story begins on October 24, 1933, in a modest terrace house on Stane Street, Hoxton in London's East End. Violet Kray gave birth to identical twin boys, Ronald arriving first, followed 10 minutes later by Reginald. From their very first breath, they would be inseparable, bound by a connection that would both elevate them to legendary status and ultimately contribute to their downfall. The East End of the 1930s was a world away from the glamorous West End. Here, in the maze of narrow streets and cramped housing, poverty was a constant companion. The area bore the scars of centuries of hardship from Jack the Ripper's reign of terror in the late 1880s to the devastating effects of economic depression. Yet it was also a community bound by fierce loyalty, where families looked after their own and where respect was earned through strength and cunning. Charles James Kray, their father, was a man who embodied the contradictions that would later define his sons. By day he worked as a wardrobe dealer buying and selling second-hand clothes. But Charlie Kray Sr. was also known for his wandering ways, often disappearing for weeks or months at a time, leaving Violet to raise the twins and their older brother Charlie Jr. Born in 1927, Violet Kray, small in stature but formidable in spirit, became the dominant force in the twins' early lives. She was fiercely protective of her boys, perhaps sensing even then that they were different from other children. Where other mothers might have been concerned by their sons' early displays of violence and antisocial behavior, Violet saw strength and potential. She dressed them identically, treated them as a unit, and instilled in them an unshakable belief that they were special, destined for greatness. The twins' early childhood was marked by signs that would have alarmed a child. Psychologists had such professionals been readily available to working-class families in 1930s London. At the age of 3, they demonstrated an uncanny ability to communicate without words, often finishing each other's sentences or acting in perfect synchronization without any apparent signal passing between them. They were inseparable, sharing not just physical space, but seeming to share thoughts and emotions. By the time they started school, their reputation preceded them. Teachers at Woodclose School in Brick Lane quickly learned that discipline problems came not as individual incidents, but as a unified front. If one twin was punished, the other would inevitably retaliate. If one was praised, the other would demand equal recognition. They were in every sense a single entity split into two bodies. Their academic performance was unremarkable. Neither twin showed particular aptitude for traditional subjects like mathematics or literature, but they excelled in areas that required physical prowess and intimidation. During playground disputes, other children quickly learned that fighting one Kray meant fighting both. The twins developed a reputation for savage retribution against anyone who crossed them, a trait that would become their trademark in later criminal endeavors. The family dynamic was complex and would profoundly shape the twins' future relationships. Violet's favoritism toward the twins created tension with their older brother Charlie, who was relegated to a supporting role in the family hierarchy. Charlie Sr.'s frequent absences meant that the twins grew up without a consistent male authority figure, instead learning to view themselves as the protectors of their mother and by extension their territory. As they entered adolescence, the differences between Ronald and Reginald began to emerge more clearly, though they remained united in purpose and loyalty. Reginald, despite being the younger twin, often took the lead in planning and strategy. He was the more articulate of the two, better able to charm adults and talk his way out of trouble. Ronald, conversely, was quicker to resort to violence, more unpredictable in his moods, and less concerned with the consequences of his actions. Their first serious brush with organized violence came through boxing. At the age of 10, both twins joined the Robert Browning Institute Boxing Club, where their natural aggression found a legitimate outlet. Under the guidance of trainer Jimmy Irwin, they developed the skills that would serve them well in their criminal careers: how to throw a devastating punch, how to take punishment without flinching, and most importantly, how to intimidate opponents through psychological warfare. Reginald showed more natural talent as a boxer with better footwork and ring intelligence. He dreamed of turning professional and making a name for himself in legitimate competition. Ronald, while equally strong and aggressive, was less disciplined in his approach. He was more interested in the fear he could instill in opponents than in the technical aspects of the sport. Their boxing careers brought them their first taste of local celebrity. In the amateur ranks, they were known throughout East London as formidable opponents. Local newspapers began to take notice, and their fights drew crowds who came as much to see the Notorious Twins as to watch boxing. This early experience with public attention would prove intoxicating, a preview of the fame they would later achieve through more notorious means. The Second World War arrived when the twins were just 6 years old, bringing with it a new set of circumstances that would further shape their development. The London Blitz transformed the East End into a war zone with nightly bombing raids, destroying homes and killing neighbors. For most children, this would have been a traumatic experience. For the Kray twins, it provided their first glimpse of how violence and chaos could create opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. During the war years, the legitimate economy struggled while black markets thrived. The twins watched as some neighbors grew wealthy through wartime profiteering while others suffered in poverty. They observed how fear could be used as currency, how information could be traded for favors, and how authority could be circumvented by those clever enough to find the loopholes. Violet Kray's response to the war was to hold her family even closer together. She refused to evacuate the twins to the countryside despite government encouragement and the obvious dangers of remaining in London. Instead, she kept them close, reinforcing their sense of being special and untouchable. When bombs fell around them and they emerged unscathed, Violet told them it was proof that they were blessed, protected by forces that did not extend the same protection to others. Their education during the war years was sporadic, interrupted by air raids and school closures. But the twins were learning lessons that would not be found in any textbook. They learned to read people's weaknesses, to spot opportunities in chaos, and to present a united front against any threat. Most importantly, they learned that conventional rules did not apply to those strong enough and clever enough to make their own rules. By the time they reached their mid-teens, the twins had established themselves as leaders among the youth of the East End. They commanded a loose group of followers who were drawn to their charisma and intimidated by their reputation for violence. These early associations would form the foundation of what would later become the firm. Their criminal organization, their first serious criminal charges came in 1949 when they were 16. Both twins were arrested for assault following a particularly vicious beating they administered to a rival gang member. who had dared to challenge their authority. The case provided an early glimpse of the loyalty they could inspire. Despite the serious nature of the charges, no witnesses came forward to testify against them, and the case was eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. This experience taught them valuable lessons about the power of reputation and fear. They realized that their growing notoriety could be as useful as physical force in controlling their territory. People who might stand up to conventional criminals fought twice before crossing the Kray Twins, not because they were necessarily more violent than others, but because they had cultivated an aura of unpredictable brutality. Their teenage years also saw the beginning of their lifelong fascination with American gangster culture. They devoured movies featuring stars like James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson. Studying the style and swagger of Hollywood's criminal characters, they began to see themselves not just as East End toughs, but as potential leaders of a criminal empire that could rival anything depicted on the silver screen. The twins' relationship with their parents during this period reflected their evolving sense of identity. They remained devoted to their mother, who continued to see them as her special boys destined for greatness. Their relationship with their father was more complex. They respected his strength and street wisdom, but were frustrated by his inability to provide consistent guidance and support. Charlie Kray Sr. had his own criminal connections, having served time for desertion from the army and being involved in various petty criminal enterprises. However, his approach was small-scale and opportunistic, lacking the grand vision that his twin sons were beginning to develop. The twins learned from his experiences, but were determined to surpass his achievements, to build something more substantial and lasting. As they approached their 18th birthdays, Ronald and Reginald Kray stood at a crossroads. They had the physical skills and local reputation necessary to make names for themselves in legitimate boxing careers. Reginald in particular showed genuine promise and had attracted the attention of professional managers. But they were also aware of the opportunities available in the criminal underworld. Opportunities that offered faster routes to the wealth and respect they craved. The choice they made would determine not just their own fates, but would reshape the landscape of organized crime in London for decades to come. They chose the path that would lead them to become legends, though whether as heroes or villains would depend entirely on one's perspective and proximity to their operations. Their early life had forged them into a single formidable entity, two minds sharing one criminal vision, two bodies capable of executing plans with unprecedented coordination. They were products of their environment, shaped by poverty, war, and the harsh realities of East End life, but they were also something more. Innovators who had transformed criminal enterprise from crude street violence into a sophisticated business operation that blurred the lines between criminality and celebrity. The transformation of Ronald and Reginald Kray from street toughs to criminal masterminds began in earnest during their late teens and early 20s. This period marked not just their entry into organized crime, but their revolutionary approach to criminal enterprise that would distinguish them from every gang that had come before. In 1950, at the age of 17, both twins were called up for national service, a compulsory military obligation that would prove to be a defining experience, though not in the way the British Army had intended. Their time in the service was marked by repeated conflicts with authority, numerous disciplinary actions, and a growing reputation for being unmanageable. Reginald initially approached military service with some degree of acceptance, seeing it as a temporary inconvenience that he could endure until returning to pursue his boxing career. Ronald, however, viewed any external authority as an intolerable challenge to his autonomy. Within weeks of their enlistment, Ronald had begun planning his escape, not just from military service, but from any system that attempted to control him. Their military records tell a story of escalating confrontations. They were involved in fights with other soldiers, refused direct orders from superior officers, and repeatedly went absent without leave. The final straw came when Ronald assaulted a corporal who had attempted to discipline him for a minor infraction. Rather than face court-martial proceedings, both twins deserted, beginning a period of living underground that would last for several months. During their time as deserters, hiding in safe houses arranged by friends and family throughout London, the twins experienced a taste of life outside conventional society. They discovered that there were entire networks of people who lived by different rules, who made their living through enterprises that existed in the shadows of legitimate business. More importantly, they realized that their reputation for violence and their unshakable loyalty to each other made them valuable assets in this underground economy. When they were eventually captured and returned to military custody, they had already begun to establish connections that would prove crucial to their later criminal success. Their court-martial hearings were marked by their complete refusal to show remorse or acknowledge the authority of the military justice system. They were sentenced to terms in military prison, but even incarceration could not break their spirit or their bond. Their prison experience was transformative. Rather than being cowed by the harsh conditions and strict discipline, they thrived in an environment where strength and cunning determined one's place in the hierarchy. They quickly established themselves as prisoners who could not be intimidated, who looked after their own interests and those of their allies, and who responded to any challenge with overwhelming violence. More importantly, prison provided them with an education in criminal methodology that they could not have received anywhere else. They met men who had operated at levels of criminal enterprise they had never imagined, who spoke of international smuggling operations, sophisticated fraud schemes, and criminal organizations that operated like legitimate businesses. They absorbed these lessons eagerly, beginning to formulate their own vision of what organized crime could become. Upon their eventual release from military prison in 1952, the twins returned to the East End as changed men. They were still only 19 years old, but their experiences had given them a maturity and criminal sophistication far beyond their years. More importantly, they had developed a clear vision of their future. They would build a criminal organization unlike anything London had ever seen. The formation of the firm began not with grand proclamations or dramatic gestures, but with the methodical takeover of existing criminal enterprises. The twins identified local operations that were poorly organized or vulnerable to outside pressure, then systematically absorbed them into their growing network. Their first major conquest was the control of several illegal gambling operations in Bethnal Green and Whitechapel. Gambling had always been a significant part of East End culture, but it had traditionally been organized by small, independent operators who ran their games with minimal security and basic record keeping. The twins introduced military-style organization and discipline to these operations, implementing systems for security, accounting, and expansion that transformed casual betting games into professional criminal enterprises. Their approach to taking over these operations was both brutally direct and surprisingly sophisticated. They would begin by offering protection services to existing operators, pointing out the various dangers that could befall unprotected gambling dens. When operators initially refused their services, they would arrange for those very dangers to materialize: raids by rival gangs, tip-offs to police, or mysterious fires that destroyed gambling equipment. However, the twins were careful to present themselves not as mere extortionists, but as businessmen offering legitimate services. They provided real security, professional management, and connections to higher-level criminal enterprises that small operators could never access on their own. Many operators found that despite having to pay tribute to the twins, their overall profits increased due to the improved organization and security the Krays provided. This pattern of conquest and consolidation was repeated across dozens of criminal enterprises throughout the early 1950s. protection rackets, illegal bookmaking, theft and fencing operations, and various forms of fraud all came under the twins' expanding umbrella of control. Each new acquisition was integrated into their growing organization using principles they had observed during their military service: clear chains of command, specialized roles for different operatives, and systematic approaches to problem solving. The genius of their approach lay in their understanding that criminal enterprise could be both more profitable and less risky if it was organized along business principles. They kept detailed records, maintained regular schedules, and treated their criminal activities as professional obligations rather than opportunistic adventures. This level of organization allowed them to operate multiple enterprises simultaneously while maintaining quality control and minimizing the risk of detection. But it was their entry into the legitimate business world that truly set them apart from traditional criminal operators. In 1954, they used the profits from their criminal enterprises to purchase their first legitimate business, a snooker hall in Mile End. This purchase marked the beginning of a strategy that would become their trademark: the use of legitimate businesses as fronts for criminal activities and as vehicles for laundering illegal profits. The snooker hall served multiple purposes in their growing empire. It provided a legitimate source of income that could be reported to tax authorities, a meeting place where criminal business could be discussed under the cover of social activity, and a base of operations that was difficult for police to monitor effectively. More importantly, it gave them a degree of respectability that they had never possessed as purely criminal operators. The success of the snooker hall led to the acquisition of additional legitimate businesses: a boxing gym, a car dealership, and several small retail establishments. Each new business was carefully chosen, not just for its profit potential, but for its usefulness in supporting their criminal activities. The boxing gym provided a training ground for enforcers and a recruiting center for new members of their organization. The car dealership gave them access to vehicles that could not be traced back to them, essential for criminal operations that required mobility and discretion. Their growing legitimate business empire also provided them with something they had craved since childhood: social respectability. As successful businessmen, they were invited to community events, consulted on local issues, and treated with the respect accorded to legitimate entrepreneurs. This respectability became a powerful tool in their criminal operations, making it difficult for authorities to pursue them aggressively without appearing to persecute successful local businessmen. The twins' understanding of public relations was sophisticated for its time. They cultivated relationships with local newspapers, providing them with stories about their business successes and charitable activities. They made sure to be photographed at community events, always immaculately dressed and accompanied by attractive women who enhanced their image as successful playboys. Their charitable activities were particularly effective at building public support. They organized boxing matches to raise money for local hospitals, provided Christmas dinners for poor families, and made well-publicized donations to various community causes. These activities served multiple purposes. They generated positive publicity, created goodwill that could be useful when they needed community support, and provided tax deductions that reduced their legitimate tax obligations. But beneath this veneer of respectability, their criminal operations continued to expand and evolve. By the mid-1950s, the firm employed dozens of people in various capacities, from street-level enforcers to sophisticated financial operators who managed their money laundering activities. They had established working relationships with criminal organizations in other parts of London and had begun to explore opportunities for expansion beyond their traditional East End territory. Their relationship with each other during this period remained extraordinarily close, though the differences in their personalities had become more pronounced. Reginald had emerged as the strategic planner and public face of their operations. He was the one who met with potential business partners, negotiated deals with other criminal organizations, and handled media relations. His natural charm and intelligence made him effective in these roles, and he enjoyed the respect and recognition they brought. Ronald, meanwhile, had developed into the organization's enforcer-in-chief. While he was capable of strategic thinking, he was more interested in the operational aspects of their criminal enterprise. He was the one who handled disciplinary matters within the organization, who negotiated with rivals from a position of strength, and who ensured that their reputation for violence remained credible. His unpredictable temperament and capacity for extreme violence made him a feared figure throughout London's criminal underworld. Despite these different roles, they continued to present themselves as a unit. Major decisions were always made jointly, and neither twin would undertake significant actions without consulting the other. This unity of purpose and presentation was one of their greatest strengths, making it difficult for rivals to play one against the other or for authorities to divide and conquer them. Their personal lives during this period reflected their growing success and sophistication. They moved their mother to a better house in a more respectable neighborhood, providing her with comforts she had never known during their impoverished childhood. They dressed expensively, drove luxury cars, and began to frequent high-end restaurants and nightclubs where they rubbed shoulders with celebrities, politicians, and other successful figures. Their romantic relationships were complex and reflected their different personalities. Reginald began a long-term relationship with Frances She, a young woman from a respectable family who represented everything he admired about legitimate society. Their relationship was passionate, but troubled as Frances struggled to reconcile her feelings for Reginald with her knowledge of his criminal activities. Ronald's romantic life was more complicated and secretive. While he maintained relationships with several women for the sake of appearances, his true sexual preferences lay elsewhere. In an era when homosexuality was not only illegal, but could destroy a man's reputation, Ronald's sexual orientation was a closely guarded secret that could have provided enemies with powerful leverage against him. Their family relationships remained central to their identity and operations. Their mother, Violet, continued to be a dominant force in their lives, providing emotional support and serving as an informal advisor on both business and personal matters. Their older brother Charlie had become an integral part of their organization, handling many of the day-to-day operations of their legitimate businesses while staying removed from the most serious criminal activities. The expansion of their territory beyond the East End began in the mid-1950s and marked their transition from local criminals to major players in London's underworld. They identified opportunities in other parts of the city where criminal enterprises were poorly organized or where existing operators were vulnerable to outside pressure. Their first major expansion was into Soho, London's entertainment district, where they saw opportunities to profit from the area's thriving nightlife and sex industry. Soho was already home to numerous criminal enterprises, but they were fragmented and competitive. The twins brought their trademark combination of violence and business acumen to the area, gradually absorbing smaller operators and establishing themselves as major players in the district's criminal ecosystem. The Soho expansion brought them into contact with a different class of criminals than they had encountered in the East End. These were sophisticated operators who dealt with wealthy clients, international visitors, and celebrities who sought discretion and high-quality service. The twins adapted their approach accordingly, learning to provide the level of sophistication and discretion these markets demanded. More importantly, their Soho operations brought them into contact with celebrities, politicians, and other public figures who would become crucial to their later success. These relationships provided them with protection from law enforcement pressure and gave them access to information and opportunities that were unavailable to traditional criminals. Their growing influence in Soho also marked the beginning of their transformation into celebrities in their own right. They began to be photographed with famous actors, musicians, and other entertainment figures, These photographs appeared in newspapers and magazines, further blurring the line between their criminal activities and their public persona. By the end of the 1950s, Ronald and Reginald Kray had achieved something unprecedented in British criminal history. They had built an organization that operated like a legitimate business while generating enormous profits from illegal activities. They had established themselves as respected figures in their community while maintaining their credibility as dangerous criminals. Most importantly, they had created a brand. The Kray name had become synonymous with power, glamour, and barely controlled violence. Their rise to power had been methodical, calculated, and extraordinarily successful. They had learned from every setback, adapted to every challenge, and consistently expanded their influence and capabilities. They had transformed themselves from street toughs into criminal masterminds, from local bullies into international figures. Their greatest achievements still lay ahead. The 1960s would bring them to the pinnacle of their power and influence, making them household names throughout Britain and establishing them as legends that would outlive their criminal careers by decades. The foundation they had built during the 1950s would support an empire that would make them the most famous criminals in British history. The 1960s dawned with London transforming itself into the cultural capital of the world. The city pulsed with new energy as music, fashion, and social revolution converged to create what would become known as Swinging London. Into this transformed landscape stepped Ronald and Reginald Kray, perfectly positioned to capitalize on the decade's opportunities and contradictions. The twins had spent the previous decade building their criminal empire methodically and carefully. But the 1960s brought them to heights of power and celebrity that exceeded even their ambitious dreams. They became not just criminal masterminds, but cultural icons. Their names as recognizable as those of rock stars and movie celebrities. It was the era when they truly became legends. Their transformation from powerful criminals to celebrity figures began with their decision to enter the nightclub business in a significant way. While they had been involved in various entertainment enterprises throughout the 1950s, their purchase and renovation of the Double R Club in Bow in 1960 marked their emergence as major players in London's nightlife scene. The Double R Club, named after the twins' shared initial, was unlike any venue London had seen before. The twins poured enormous resources into creating an establishment that could compete with the most exclusive clubs in the West End. They hired top designers to create an atmosphere of sophisticated glamour, brought in the best sound equipment available, and established a dress code that ensured their clientele would be appropriately stylish. But the Double R Club's true innovation lay in its deliberate cultivation of a dangerous glamour. Unlike traditional nightclubs that tried to hide any criminal connections, the twins made their reputation part of the club's appeal. Patrons came not just for the music and atmosphere, but for the thrill of rubbing shoulders with notorious criminals in an environment that felt both safe and exciting. The club's opening night in early 1960 established it as the place to be seen in London. The guest list read like a who's who of British entertainment: actors, musicians, models, and television personalities, all mingled with criminals, politicians, and business figures in an atmosphere that was both sophisticated and slightly dangerous. The twins had created something unprecedented. A space where the criminal underworld and legitimate society could interact openly and comfortably. The success of the Double R Club led to the acquisition of additional nightclub properties throughout London. Each new venue was carefully positioned to serve a different market segment while maintaining the Kray brand of dangerous glamour. They opened clubs in Soho that catered to tourists and celebrity visitors, establishments in the East End that served their traditional base of support, and exclusive venues in upscale neighborhoods that attracted wealthy socialites seeking excitement. Their nightclub empire served multiple purposes beyond simple profit generation. These venues provided perfect fronts for money laundering operations, allowing them to convert criminal proceeds into apparently legitimate income. They served as meeting places where criminal business could be conducted under the cover of social activity. Most importantly, they provided the twins with platforms for cultivating relationships with the influential figures who would become crucial to their protection and expansion. But the celebrity connections they developed during this period were extraordinary in their scope and significance. They became friends with major film stars like Diana Dors and Barbara Windsor, musicians including members of popular bands, and television personalities whose faces were familiar to millions of Britons. These were not casual acquaintances, but genuine friendships built on mutual respect and shared interests. What made these relationships particularly powerful was their reciprocal nature. The celebrities gained access to exclusive venues and exciting social circles that enhanced their public images and personal enjoyment. The twins gained respectability, protection from negative publicity, and access to information and opportunities that were unavailable to traditional criminals. When newspapers considered negative stories about the Krays, they had to weigh the potential impact on beloved entertainment figures who were known to be their friends. Their political connections were equally impressive and perhaps even more valuable. They cultivated relationships with members of parliament, local councillors, and other political figures who could provide protection from law enforcement pressure and advanced warning of potential investigations. These relationships were built carefully over time using a combination of social interaction, financial support, and subtle intimidation to ensure loyalty. One of their most significant political relationships was with Tom Dryburgh, a prominent Labour MP who was also a well-known socialite and party-goer. Dryburgh's friendship with the twins provided them with insights into government policy and political developments that allowed them to anticipate and prepare for challenges to their operations. In return, they provided him with protection, entertainment, and access to their glamorous social circle. The twins' relationship with the media during this period was particularly sophisticated and effective. Rather than trying to avoid publicity, they actively cultivated relationships with journalists and photographers who could help shape their public image. They understood that in the emerging celebrity culture of the 1960s, fame itself was a form of power that could be used to protect and advance their interests. They were regular subjects of newspaper features and magazine profiles that portrayed them as successful businessmen and colorful local characters. These articles typically minimized or ignored their criminal activities while emphasizing their business acumen, their loyalty to family and friends, and their contributions to their community. The twins were careful to present themselves as Robin Hood-like figures who protected ordinary people from more dangerous criminals and corrupt authorities. Their celebrity status was enhanced by their association with major cultural events and figures of the decade. They were photographed with members of the Beatles, attended premieres of major films, and were regular guests at high society parties and events. These associations created a feedback loop where their fame increased their access to celebrities, which in turn increased their fame. The international dimension of their operations also expanded significantly during this period. They established connections with criminal organizations in other European countries, exploring opportunities for smuggling operations, money laundering schemes, and other enterprises that required international cooperation. These relationships were facilitated by their growing reputation and the connections they had developed through their entertainment industry friends. Their relationship with American organized crime was particularly significant. They established contact with members of prominent American crime families who were impressed by their sophistication and celebrity connections. These relationships provided them with access to international criminal opportunities and enhanced their status within the British criminal underworld. The twins' personal lives during their peak period reflected their extraordinary success and the contradictions it created. Reginald's relationship with Frances Shee had evolved into an engagement. Though it was troubled by the tensions between his criminal activities and her desire for a conventional life, Frances represented everything Reginald admired about legitimate society. But she also represented the limitations that conventional life would place on his ambitions and activities. Their relationship became increasingly strained as Reginald's criminal activities became more serious and his celebrity status made it impossible to maintain the fiction that he was simply a successful businessman. Frances was pressured by her family to end the relationship while Reginald was torn between his love for her and his commitment to the criminal empire he and his brother had built. Ronald's personal life remained complex and secretive. His homosexual relationships continued to be carefully hidden from public view, though rumors circulated within London's entertainment and criminal circles. His sexual orientation remained a potential vulnerability that his enemies could exploit, but it also connected him to an underground network of gay men in entertainment and political circles that provided valuable intelligence and connections. The twins' relationship with each other during this period remained extraordinarily close, though the pressures of their expanding empire created new tensions and challenges. They had developed clearly defined roles within their organization. Reginald handled strategic planning, media relations, and legitimate business operations, while Ronald managed enforcement activities, territorial expansion, and relationships with other criminal organizations. Despite these different responsibilities, they continued to present a united front to the outside world. Major decisions were still made jointly, and neither would undertake significant actions without consulting the other. Their telepathic connection, which had been evident since childhood, remained strong and provided them with a significant advantage in negotiations and confrontations, where they could communicate without speaking. Their business operations during this period were extraordinarily sophisticated and diverse. In addition to their nightclub empire and traditional protection rackets, they had expanded into real estate development, legitimate entertainment booking, and various forms of white-collar crime that generated enormous profits with relatively low risk of detection. Their protection rackets had evolved far beyond simple extortion to become comprehensive security and business consulting services. They provided genuine value to their clients by protecting them from rival gangs, helping them resolve business disputes, and connecting them with opportunities for expansion and development. Many clients found that their association with the Krays actually improved their business prospects by providing them with credibility and connections they could not have accessed otherwise. Their legitimate businesses had grown to include dozens of properties and enterprises throughout London. These businesses served multiple purposes. They provided legal sources of income for tax purposes. They offered employment opportunities for members of their organization. And they created a complex web of financial relationships that made it difficult for authorities to trace their criminal proceeds. The sophistication of their money laundering operations was particularly impressive. They had developed networks of accountants, lawyers, and financial advisors who helped them convert criminal proceeds into legitimate investments. They owned properties throughout London and had investments in businesses ranging from entertainment to manufacturing. These investments provided them with diverse income streams and protection against economic downturns. Their organizational structure had also evolved to meet the demands of their expanding empire. The firm now employed hundreds of people in various capacities, from street-level operatives to sophisticated white-collar criminals who managed their financial operations. They had developed specialized units for different types of criminal activity, each with its own leadership structure and operational procedures. The discipline and loyalty they maintained within this large organization was remarkable. Despite employing hundreds of people in criminal activities over many years, they experienced very few defections or security breaches. This loyalty was maintained through a combination of generous compensation, opportunities for advancement, and a well-deserved reputation for severe punishment of disloyalty. Their territorial control had expanded beyond London to include operations in other major British cities. They had established partnerships with local criminal organizations that allowed them to extend their influence while avoiding the costs and risks of direct expansion. These partnerships were typically structured as mutual assistance agreements, where the Krays provided expertise and resources in exchange for shares of profits from local operations. The peak of their celebrity status came in the mid-1960s, when they were featured on the cover of national magazines and were the subjects of television documentaries that portrayed them as fascinating examples of modern criminal entrepreneurship. These media appearances enhanced their reputation and made them household names throughout Britain. Their influence on popular culture during this period was significant and lasting. They inspired novels, films, and songs that romanticized their lifestyle and activities. Fashion designers began creating clothes inspired by their sophisticated style, and their East End origins became fashionable among celebrities and socialites who wanted to associate themselves with their dangerous glamour. But even at the height of their success, there were signs that their empire was beginning to face serious challenges. Law enforcement pressure was increasing as their high profile made it difficult for authorities to ignore their criminal activities. Internal tensions within their organization were growing as success created new opportunities for conflict and betrayal. Most importantly, their celebrity status, which had been one of their greatest assets, was beginning to attract unwanted attention from investigative journalists and reform-minded politicians who saw them as symbols of corruption and criminal influence. The very success that had made them legends was also creating the conditions that would eventually lead to their downfall. Their high profile made them obvious targets for law enforcement agencies, seeking to demonstrate their effectiveness against organized crime. Their wealth and influence created jealousy and resentment among rivals, who were seeking opportunities to challenge their dominance. Their celebrity connections, while providing protection, also created expectations and obligations that limited their freedom of action. As the 1960s reached their midpoint, Ronald and Reginald Kray stood at the pinnacle of power and influence that no British criminals had ever achieved. They were wealthy beyond their childhood dreams, famous throughout the nation, and respected by both criminals and celebrities. They had built an empire that seemed unshakable and had achieved a level of success that seemed to prove they were indeed as special as their mother had always told them they were. But their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The very qualities that had made them successful, their ambition, their violence, their need for respect and recognition, would soon drive them to actions that would destroy everything they had built and transform them from celebrated criminals into hunted fugitives. The transformation from criminal celebrities to marked men began not with a single dramatic event, but with a series of escalating confrontations and increasingly reckless decisions that revealed the fundamental contradictions at the heart of the Kray empire. By 1965, the twins had achieved everything they had dreamed of during their impoverished childhood. But their success had created new pressures and expectations that would ultimately prove impossible to manage. The first signs of trouble emerged from within their own organization. The firm had grown to such a size and complexity that it had become difficult to manage effectively. With hundreds of employees and dozens of different criminal enterprises operating simultaneously, maintaining the discipline and loyalty that had been the foundation of their success became increasingly challenging. The wealth and power that membership in the firm provided had attracted individuals who were motivated more by personal gain than by loyalty to the twins. These newer members lacked the personal connections and shared history that bound the original members together. They were more likely to cut deals with law enforcement if pressured, more willing to pursue their own interests at the expense of organizational goals, and less committed to the code of silence that had protected the organization for years. Internal conflicts began to emerge over territory, profits, and status within the organization. Some members felt they deserved larger shares of profits or greater autonomy in their operations. Others resented the strict discipline and feared the violent punishment that could result from even minor infractions. These tensions created opportunities for law enforcement agencies to exploit divisions within the organization and recruit informants from among disaffected members. The twins' response to these internal challenges revealed both their strengths and their fatal weaknesses. They were effective at identifying and addressing specific problems, but their solutions often relied on increased violence and intimidation that created new problems while solving old ones. Their need to maintain absolute control and respect within their organization drove them to increasingly extreme measures that alienated even loyal supporters and attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement. The changing landscape of London's criminal underworld also created new challenges for the Kray Empire. The 1960s had brought new opportunities for criminal enterprise, but they had also brought new competitors who were younger, more flexible, and less burdened by the need to maintain celebrity status and legitimate business facades. These new criminal organizations were often more focused on specific types of illegal activity, drug trafficking, armed robbery, or white-collar fraud, and were willing to operate with lower profiles and higher levels of violence than the Krays had traditionally employed. They saw the twins' celebrity status and legitimate business interests as vulnerabilities rather than strengths, and they were increasingly willing to challenge Kray dominance in areas where they had previously been unchallenged. The twins' response to this increased competition revealed their inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Rather than adjusting their strategies to meet new challenges, they doubled down on the approaches that had brought them success in the past. They relied more heavily on their reputation for violence, increased their territorial demands, and responded to challenges with overwhelming force that often created more problems than it solved. Law enforcement pressure was also intensifying in ways that the twins found increasingly difficult to manage. The Metropolitan Police had created specialized units, focused specifically on organized crime with resources and expertise that far exceeded anything that had been deployed against them in the past. These units were staffed by officers who were specifically selected for their integrity and resistance to corruption, making the traditional approaches of bribery and intimidation less effective. The political climate was also shifting in ways that reduced the protection the twins had previously enjoyed from their high-level connections. Public concern about organized crime was growing, fueled by media coverage that portrayed criminal organizations as threats to social order and democratic institutions. Politicians who had previously been willing to maintain friendly relationships with the twins found it increasingly difficult to justify these associations to their constituents and colleagues. The twins' celebrity status, which had been one of their greatest assets, was becoming a liability in this changed environment. Their high profile made it impossible for law enforcement agencies to ignore their activities, and their fame made them obvious targets for prosecutors seeking to demonstrate their effectiveness against organized crime. The very publicity they had cultivated to protect themselves was now being used against them by their enemies. The pressure of these mounting challenges began to affect the twins' judgment and decision-making in ways that would prove catastrophic. The stress of maintaining their empire while dealing with increasing threats from multiple directions began to take a psychological toll that manifested in increasingly erratic and violent behavior. Ronald in particular began to show signs of mental instability that his closest associates found alarming. His violent outbursts became more frequent and unpredictable, and his paranoid suspicions about potential enemies and traitors within the organization began to affect his ability to make rational decisions. Friends and family members noticed changes in his personality that suggested he was struggling with psychological pressures that exceeded his ability to cope. Reginald remained more stable and rational, but he was increasingly caught between his loyalty to his brother and his recognition that Ronald's behavior was becoming dangerous to their organization and their personal safety. The unity that had been their greatest strength was beginning to crack under the pressure of their deteriorating circumstances. Their personal relationships were also suffering under the strain of their mounting problems. Reginald's relationship with Frances. She reached a crisis point as she became increasingly unable to reconcile her love for him with the reality of his criminal activities and the dangers they brought to everyone around him. The pressure from her family to end the relationship was intensifying, and Reginald was finding it increasingly difficult to provide her with the security and normality she needed. The couple's marriage in 1965 was intended to resolve these tensions, but it actually intensified them. Frances had hoped that marriage would lead Reginald to distance himself from criminal activities and focus on legitimate business interests instead. She found that her association with the Kray name made her a target for both law enforcement surveillance and criminal threats from rivals, who saw her as a potential weakness they could exploit. The psychological pressure of living under constant scrutiny and threat began to affect Frances's mental health severely. She became increasingly isolated and depressed, unable to enjoy the social activities and celebrity connections that were supposed to be among the benefits of her association with the Krays. Her deteriorating mental state became another source of stress for Reginald, who found himself torn between his criminal obligations and his desire to protect and support his wife. Their relationship with their mother, Violet, also became more complicated during this period. She remained fiercely loyal to her sons and continued to provide them with emotional support and practical assistance. However, she was also increasingly aware of the dangers they faced and the likelihood that their criminal activities would eventually lead to their imprisonment or death. Violet's attempts to persuade her sons to reduce their criminal activities and focus on legitimate business interests were unsuccessful, but they added another dimension to the psychological pressures they were experiencing. Her obvious worry and fear for their safety reminded them constantly of the risks they were taking and the potential consequences of their choices. The first major crack in their facade of invincibility came with the murder of George Cornell on March 9, 1966. Cornell was a member of the rival Richardson gang who had made the fatal mistake of publicly insulting Ronald Kray in a pub frequented by criminal associates and potential witnesses. The insult itself was relatively minor, but it occurred at a time when Ronald's paranoia and need to maintain respect had reached dangerous levels. Ronald's decision to murder Cornell was made impulsively, without the careful planning and consideration that had characterized their major criminal actions in the past. He walked into the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel, where Cornell was drinking, and shot him dead in front of multiple witnesses. The brazen nature of the killing and the public setting made it impossible to deny or cover up, creating the first major crisis that the twins could not manage through their traditional methods of intimidation and influence. The Cornell murder marked a turning point in the twins' relationship with law enforcement and the criminal underworld. It demonstrated that they were willing to commit murder in public settings without regard for the consequences, making them unpredictable and dangerous even by criminal standards. It also provided law enforcement agencies with a clear example of their willingness to use lethal violence that could be used to justify increased pressure and resources directed against their organization. The investigation of Cornell's murder became a major priority for the Metropolitan Police, who assigned their best detectives to the case and provided them with resources that had previously been unavailable for investigations of criminal violence. The high-profile nature of the case and the public setting of the murder made it impossible for the twins to use their traditional methods of witness intimidation and evidence suppression effectively. Despite the intensive investigation, the twins initially managed to avoid prosecution for Cornell's murder. Their reputation for violence was so well established that potential witnesses were too frightened to testify against them. and physical evidence was limited due to the primitive forensic techniques available at the time. However, the investigation established patterns of surveillance and intelligence gathering that would eventually prove crucial to their eventual downfall. The Cornell murder also had significant effects within the criminal underworld. It demonstrated that the twins were willing to kill rivals over relatively minor provocations, making them unpredictable partners and dangerous enemies. Some criminal associates began to distance themselves from the twins, while others began to consider whether they might be safer cooperating with law enforcement than continuing to work with increasingly unstable and violent partners. The twins' response to the aftermath of the Cornell murder revealed their inability to adapt to the changed circumstances their actions had created. Rather than recognizing that they needed to reduce their profile and moderate their behavior, they became more aggressive in asserting their dominance and maintaining their reputation for violence. They interpreted the fear and distance shown by some associates as signs of disrespect that required violent correction. This escalating pattern of violence and retaliation created a spiral of increasing risk and decreasing control that would ultimately prove impossible to manage. Each new act of violence created new enemies and new investigations, while simultaneously reducing the number of allies and supporters who were willing to provide protection and assistance. The twins' celebrity status, which had previously protected them from serious law enforcement pressure, became a liability as their violent actions made it impossible for their famous friends to maintain public associations with them. Politicians, entertainers, and business figures who had previously been willing to socialize with them began to worry about the potential damage to their own reputations from continued association with increasingly notorious criminals. The psychological pressure of their deteriorating situation began to manifest in increasingly erratic behavior from both twins, but particularly from Ronald. His paranoid suspicions about potential enemies and traitors within the organization became more extreme and less rational. He began to see threats everywhere and to interpret normal business disputes and personality conflicts as evidence of deliberate betrayal requiring violent punishment. These psychological problems were exacerbated by the twins' increasing use of alcohol and drugs as they struggled to cope with the stress of their situation. Their drug use, which had been occasional and recreational, became more frequent and problematic as they sought escape from the mounting pressures they faced. The combination of psychological instability, substance abuse, and mounting external pressure created a dangerous situation where the twins were increasingly likely to make irrational and self-destructive decisions. Their judgment became impaired at precisely the time when they most needed clear thinking and careful planning to navigate the challenges they faced. The stage was set for the final act of their criminal careers. The empire they had built through careful planning, strategic thinking, and calculated violence was beginning to collapse under the weight of their own success and the psychological pressures it had created. Their need to maintain respect and control was driving them toward actions that would ultimately destroy everything they had worked to build. The murder of Jack the Hat McVitie would prove to be the final straw that brought down their empire. But it was only the culmination of a process of deterioration that had been building for years. Their transformation from celebrated criminals to hunted fugitives was nearly complete, and the consequences of their choices were about to become inescapable. The evening of October 29, 1967, began like many others for the Kray twins. A night that should have been devoted to the routine business of managing their criminal empire. Instead, it became the night that sealed their fate and marked the beginning of the end of their reign over London's underworld. Jack the Hat McVitie was a minor criminal who worked on the fringes of the Kray organization. He was a man of limited intelligence and considerable ego, characteristics that made him useful for certain types of criminal work, but also made him unreliable and potentially dangerous to the organization's security. McVitie had been hired by the twins to carry out a contract killing, but had taken their money and failed to complete the job. This failure was bad enough. But McVitie had compounded his error by boasting publicly about how he had outsmarted the famous Kray Twins, claiming he had taken their money and had no intention of fulfilling his obligations. In the paranoid atmosphere that had surrounded the twins since the Cornell murder, this boastfulness was seen as an intolerable challenge to their authority and reputation. The decision to kill McVitie was made by both twins, but it reflected Ronald's increasing inability to distinguish between genuine threats to their organization and minor provocations that could have been handled through less drastic means. In earlier years, they might have resolved the McVitie problem through a severe beating or public humiliation that would have restored their reputation without creating the risks associated with murder. But the psychological pressures they were under had reduced their ability to make such nuanced judgments. The plan to murder McVitie was typical of the twins' deteriorating judgment during this period, rather than the careful preparation that had characterized their earlier criminal enterprises. The McVitie killing was planned hastily and executed in a manner that created unnecessary risks and evidence. They chose to carry out the murder at a party in Stoke Newington in front of multiple witnesses, whose loyalty to the organization was uncertain. The murder itself was particularly brutal, even by the standards of criminal violence. When McVitie arrived at the party, expecting a social gathering, he was immediately set upon by the twins and their associates. Ronald attempted to shoot him, but the gun malfunctioned, creating a chaotic situation where multiple people were involved in restraining the victim while alternatives were considered. The actual killing was carried out by Reginald, who stabbed McVitie repeatedly with a carving knife in a frenzy of violence that shocked even hardened criminals who were present. The brutality of the killing and the number of witnesses present made it impossible to cover up or deny, creating immediate problems for the organization that the twins proved unable to solve effectively. The aftermath of the McVitie murder revealed how far the twins' capabilities had deteriorated. In earlier years, they had been masters of damage control, able to manage witnesses, dispose of evidence, and create alternative explanations for events that protected them from legal consequences. The McVitie murder, however, was handled so poorly that it provided law enforcement agencies with exactly the kind of evidence they needed to build successful prosecutions. The body was disposed of hastily and inadequately, creating evidence that could potentially be discovered by investigators. More importantly, the number of witnesses present and their uncertain loyalty to the organization created opportunities for law enforcement to recruit informants who could provide detailed first-hand accounts of the murder and the organization's structure and operations. Detective Superintendent Leonard Nipper Reed, who had been assigned to lead the investigation of the Kray organization, recognized that the McVitie murder represented a turning point in his efforts to build cases against the twins. Unlike the Cornell murder, which had occurred in a public place with frightened witnesses who could be intimidated into silence, the McVitie murder had taken place in a controlled environment with witnesses whose relationships to the organization made them potentially vulnerable to pressure from law enforcement. Reed's investigation strategy was methodical and patient, designed to exploit the psychological pressures and internal tensions that were already weakening the Kray organization. Rather than attempting to build cases through direct confrontation with the twins or their most loyal supporters, he focused on identifying and pressuring peripheral members of the organization who had knowledge of serious crimes but limited personal loyalty to the leadership. The investigation was also supported by resources and legal authorities that had not been available in earlier efforts to prosecute the twins. Changes in British law enforcement procedures and the high priority placed on the case by senior police officials provided Reed's team with surveillance capabilities, investigative tools, and prosecutorial support that made their task significantly easier than it would have been in previous years. The psychological pressure created by the intensive investigation began to affect the twins and their organization in ways that accelerated their decline. The constant surveillance and questioning of associates created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that made it difficult for the organization to function effectively. Members began to worry more about protecting themselves from legal consequences than about advancing organizational interests. Ronald's mental state deteriorated rapidly under the pressure of the investigation. His paranoid suspicions about potential informants within the organization became more extreme and less rational, leading him to threaten and sometimes assault associates whose loyalty had previously been unquestionable. These actions further undermined organizational cohesion and created additional incentives for members to consider cooperation with law enforcement as a means of protecting themselves. Reginald remained more rational and strategic in his thinking, but he was increasingly overwhelmed by the need to manage both the investigation and his brother's deteriorating mental condition. His efforts to maintain organizational discipline while dealing with mounting legal pressure and Ronald's erratic behavior stretched his capabilities beyond their limits and reduced his effectiveness as a leader and planner. The twins' celebrity status, which had previously provided them with protection from law enforcement pressure, now worked against them by making their case a high priority for prosecutors and police administrators seeking to demonstrate their effectiveness against organized crime. The media attention surrounding the investigation made it impossible for authorities to quietly abandon or reduce their efforts. Even when the investigation proved difficult and expensive, their friends and political connections, who had previously provided informal protection and advanced warning of law enforcement activities, began to distance themselves from the twins as the seriousness of the charges against them became clear. Politicians and celebrities who had been willing to socialize with successful criminals were unwilling to associate themselves with suspected murderers facing life imprisonment. The investigation also revealed the extent to which the twins' empire had been built on fear rather than genuine loyalty. As the pressure mounted and the likelihood of prosecutions increased, many associates who had appeared completely loyal began to consider their options and calculate their chances of avoiding prison sentences through cooperation with law enforcement. The first major breakthrough in the investigation came when members of the organization began to provide information to police in exchange for reduced charges or immunity from prosecution. These initial defections created a cascade effect as other members realized that their own silence would not be protected by organizational loyalty if their colleagues were already cooperating with authorities. The twins' response to these defections revealed their complete inability to adapt to their changed circumstances. Rather than recognizing that their organization was collapsing and attempting to negotiate plea agreements that might limit their prison sentences, they continued to rely on intimidation and violence in situations where these tactics were not only ineffective, but actually counterproductive. Their threats against potential witnesses and informants were detected by law enforcement surveillance and used as evidence of additional crimes, while their attempts to maintain organizational discipline through violence only provided authorities with more evidence of their criminal activities and more incentives for associates to cooperate with the investigation. The psychological toll of their deteriorating situation became increasingly apparent in their personal behavior and relationships. Reginald's marriage to Frances Shee, which had already been strained by the pressures of his criminal career, reached a breaking point as the reality of his likely imprisonment became clear. Frances had been hoping that legal pressure would force Reginald to choose between his criminal activities and their relationship, but instead, she found that the mounting pressure made him more committed to his criminal identity and less available for the emotional support she needed. The tragedy of Frances's suicide in June 1967 devastated Reginald and removed one of the few stabilizing influences in his life. Her death was attributed to an overdose of pills, but those close to the situation understood that she had been driven to despair by the impossibility of her situation and the constant stress of living under surveillance and threat. Francis's death marked a turning point in Reginald's psychological state and his approach to the mounting legal pressure. The guilt and grief he felt over her death, combined with his anger at the circumstances that had contributed to it, made him less rational and more willing to take risks that endangered both himself and his organization. The final phase of the investigation moved quickly once law enforcement agencies had secured cooperation from key members of the organization. The evidence gathered through witness testimony, surveillance, and forensic investigation provided prosecutors with strong cases for multiple serious charges, including the murders of Cornell and McVitie. On May 8, 1968, coordinated raids were carried out simultaneously at multiple locations associated with the Kray organization. The twins were arrested at their mother's house in Bethnal Green, where they had been staying while attempting to manage the crisis facing their organization. The simultaneity and scale of the arrests demonstrated the thoroughness of the investigation and the extent to which law enforcement had penetrated their organization. The arrests marked the effective end of the Kray empire, though the twins would not be convicted and sentenced until the following year. Their organization, which had once seemed impregnable, collapsed almost immediately once its leadership was removed. Associates scattered, legitimate businesses were closed or sold, and the complex network of relationships that had supported their criminal activities disintegrated. The media coverage of their arrests was extensive and sensational, reflecting both the public fascination with their criminal careers and the relief that they had finally been caught. Newspapers and television programs provided detailed coverage of the arrests and the charges against them, often focusing on the dramatic contrast between their former celebrity status and their current situation as prisoners facing life sentences. The twins' response to their arrests and the charges against them revealed their continued inability to accept the reality of their situation. Rather than attempting to negotiate plea agreements or cooperate with authorities to reduce their sentences, they maintained their innocence and continued to believe that their reputation and connections would somehow protect them from serious consequences. This delusional thinking extended to their expectations about the trial proceedings and their confidence that they could either intimidate witnesses or charm juries into acquitting them. They failed to recognize that the evidence against them was overwhelming and that their former celebrity status was now working against them by making their prosecution a high priority for the justice system. The arrest and charging of Ronald and Reginald Kray marked the end of an era in British organized crime. Their empire, which had once seemed unshakable, had collapsed under the weight of their own psychological problems and the mounting pressure from law enforcement agencies that had finally adapted their methods to deal with sophisticated criminal organizations. The twins, who had once been celebrated as criminal masterminds, were now revealed as men whose success had been built on a combination of violence, intimidation, and psychological manipulation that ultimately proved unsustainable. Their transformation from celebrities to prisoners awaiting trial for murder was complete, and their fate would soon be decided by the very legal system they had spent their careers trying to circumvent. The trial of Ronald and Reginald Kray opened at the Old Bailey on January 8, 1969, to unprecedented media attention and public interest for 8 weeks. The proceedings would dominate British newspapers and capture the imagination of a public fascinated by the fall of the twins who had once seemed untouchable. The courtroom became a theater where the full extent of their criminal empire would be revealed. Their carefully constructed public image would be dismantled, and their fate would be sealed. The prosecution team, led by Kenneth Jones QC, had assembled what they believed to be an overwhelming case against the twins. They had secured testimony from dozens of witnesses, including former associates who had decided to cooperate with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences or immunity from prosecution. The evidence included not only testimony about the murders of George Cornell and Jack McVitie, but detailed accounts of the twins' criminal enterprises, methods of operation, and organizational structure. The defense strategy, crafted by some of Britain's most experienced criminal barristers, was based on challenging the credibility of prosecution witnesses and attempting to create reasonable doubt about the twins' involvement in the specific crimes charged. The defense team recognized that their client's reputation as criminals was well established and impossible to deny, but they hoped to distinguish between being known criminals and being guilty of the specific murders for which they were being prosecuted. The selection of the jury proved to be a complex process that revealed the extent to which the Kray name had penetrated British popular culture. Many potential jurors had to be dismissed because they had preconceived opinions about the twins, based on newspaper coverage or personal knowledge of their reputation. The final jury consisted of individuals who claimed to have no strong prior opinions about the case, though the defense worried that such claims might not reflect the reality of public awareness about the defendants. The opening statements provided the first public glimpse of the evidence that would be presented during the trial. The prosecution painted a picture of a criminal organization that had operated through systematic violence and intimidation, describing the twins as ruthless killers who had murdered Cornell and McVitie to maintain their reputation and control over their criminal empire. The defense countered by portraying the twins as successful businessmen who had been targeted by law enforcement agencies seeking high-profile prosecutions to advance their careers. They argued that the prosecution's case was based primarily on the testimony of unreliable witnesses who had their own reasons for lying about the twins' involvement in serious crimes. The testimony of prosecution witnesses provided the British public with its first detailed look inside the Kray organization and the methods by which the twins had built and maintained their criminal empire. Witness after witness described the atmosphere of fear and violence that had surrounded the twins, the systematic way they had eliminated rivals and punished disloyalty, and the specific circumstances surrounding the murders for which they were being prosecuted. The testimony about the Cornell murder was particularly damaging to Ronald's case. Multiple witnesses described his impulsive decision to kill Cornell over a relatively minor insult, his brazen entry into the Blind Beggar pub, and the cold-blooded manner in which he had shot Cornell dead in front of numerous witnesses. The witnesses' accounts were consistent and detailed, making it difficult for the defense to create reasonable doubt about Ronald's responsibility for the murder. The testimony about the McVitie murder was equally damaging to Reginald's case, though the circumstances were more complex and chaotic than those surrounding the Cornell killing. Witnesses described the party at which McVitie had been murdered, the failed attempt to shoot him, and the brutal stabbing that had followed. The testimony revealed Reginald as an active participant in a particularly savage killing that demonstrated both premeditation and extreme brutality. The defense team's cross-examination of prosecution witnesses was aggressive and thorough, focusing on their criminal backgrounds, their motivations for testifying against the twins, and any inconsistencies in their accounts of events. Some witnesses were revealed to have extensive criminal records and strong incentives to cooperate with prosecution in exchange for lenient treatment for their own crimes. However, the sheer number of witnesses and the consistency of their core testimony made it difficult for the defense to undermine the prosecution's case significantly. Even if individual witnesses had credibility problems, the overall pattern of testimony painted a convincing picture of the twins' involvement in serious criminal activities and the specific murders for which they were being prosecuted. The twins themselves presented contrasting figures during the trial proceedings. Reginald maintained the composed, articulate demeanor that had served him well during his criminal career, often appearing more like a successful businessman than a dangerous criminal. He was well-dressed, polite to court officials, and careful in his responses to questions. Ronald, by contrast, showed clear signs of the mental deterioration that had contributed to their downfall. He was often agitated and unpredictable in his behavior, sometimes making inappropriate comments or gestures that undermined his defense team's efforts to present him in a favorable light. His appearance and demeanor supported the prosecution's portrayal of him as a dangerous and unstable individual capable of impulsive violence. The testimony about the twins' celebrity connections and legitimate business interests provided fascinating insights into how they had managed to maintain their criminal activities while operating in plain sight of law enforcement and the media. Witnesses described a carefully constructed facade of respectability that had protected them for years, and their relationships with politicians, entertainers, and business figures that had provided them with information and protection. However, this testimony also revealed the extent to which their celebrity status had been based on fear rather than genuine respect or affection. Many of their famous associates were shown to have maintained relationships with the twins primarily because they were afraid of the consequences of refusing their friendship rather than because they genuinely enjoyed their company or respected their achievements. The prosecution's presentation of evidence about the twins' business empire revealed the sophisticated methods they had used to launder criminal proceeds and maintain the appearance of legitimate success. Financial experts testified about the complex web of companies, properties, and investments the twins had used to convert illegal profits into apparently legal assets. This evidence was particularly damaging because it demonstrated that the twins had been engaged in systematic criminal enterprise over many years, rather than being guilty only of the specific crimes for which they were being prosecuted. It showed them to be sophisticated criminals who had planned and organized their activities carefully rather than impulsive individuals who had committed isolated acts of violence. The defense's case relied heavily on challenging the reliability of prosecution witnesses and suggesting that the twins had been framed by law enforcement agencies seeking high-profile convictions. They presented evidence about the intense pressure that had been placed on potential witnesses to testify against the twins and suggested that some testimony had been fabricated or exaggerated to satisfy prosecutorial expectations. However, the defense was hampered by their clients' well-established reputations as violent criminals and their inability to present credible alternative explanations for the evidence against them. While they could raise questions about specific details of prosecution testimony, they could not present a coherent alternative narrative that would explain away the overwhelming evidence of the twins' criminal activities. The twins' decision not to testify in their own defense was controversial and probably reflected their lawyers' recognition that their testimony would be more likely to damage than help their cases. Both twins had strong personalities and were accustomed to controlling conversations and situations, but the structured environment of cross-examination would have exposed them to questions they could not avoid or deflect. The closing arguments provided both sides with opportunities to present their final interpretations of the evidence and their arguments about the twins' guilt or innocence. The prosecution emphasized the overwhelming nature of the evidence against the twins and argued that their sophisticated criminal organization represented a serious threat to public safety and required severe punishment. The defense continued to challenge the reliability of prosecution witnesses and argued that the twins had been targeted unfairly by law enforcement agencies seeking to make examples of high-profile criminals. They suggested that the evidence against the twins was insufficient to support convictions for murder, and that the prosecution had failed to prove their cases beyond reasonable doubt. The jury deliberations lasted several days, reflecting the complexity of the evidence and the seriousness of the charges during this period. There was intense speculation in the media about the likely outcome and what sentences the twins might receive if convicted. The delay in reaching verdicts added to the tension and public interest surrounding the case. When the verdicts were finally announced on March 5, 1969, Both twins were found guilty of the murders for which they had been prosecuted. Ronald was convicted of murdering George Cornell, while Reginald was convicted of murdering Jack McVitie. Both were also convicted of various other charges related to their criminal enterprises and organizational activities. The sentencing hearing provided the judge with an opportunity to comment on the broader implications of the case and the threat that organized crime posed to British society. Mr. Justice Melford Stevenson sentenced both twins to life imprisonment with recommendations that they serve minimum terms of 30 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. The sentences were among the most severe ever imposed for murder in British legal history and reflected both the seriousness of the crimes and the judge's assessment of the twins as particularly dangerous criminals who posed ongoing threats to public safety. The recommendation of 30-year minimum terms meant that the twins, who were 35 years old at the time of sentencing, would not be eligible for release until they were in their mid-60s, if at all. The twins' reactions to their sentences revealed their continued inability to accept the reality of their situation. Rather than expressing remorse for their crimes or accepting responsibility for the consequences of their actions, they maintained their innocence and expressed confidence that their convictions would eventually be overturned on appeal. Their appeals, filed shortly after their convictions, challenged both the legal procedures followed during their trial and the sufficiency of the evidence used to convict them. However, the appeal courts upheld their convictions and sentences, finding that they had received fair trials and that the evidence against them had been overwhelming. The imprisonment of Ronald and Reginald Kray marked the definitive end of their criminal empire and their transformation from celebrated criminals to ordinary prisoners serving life sentences. Their organization, which had once employed hundreds of people and controlled criminal enterprises throughout London, had collapsed completely following their arrests and convictions. The twins were initially imprisoned together, but prison authorities soon decided that separation would be necessary to prevent them from continuing to operate as a unit and potentially organizing criminal activities from within the prison system. This separation was traumatic for both twins, who had never been apart for extended periods during their entire lives. Reginald was sent to Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight, where he was classified as a category, a prisoner requiring the highest level of security. The prison regime was strict and designed to prevent escape attempts and minimize contact with the outside world. Reginald initially struggled to adapt to the loss of freedom and status that imprisonment represented, but eventually developed routines and relationships that helped him cope with his situation. Ronald was imprisoned at Broadmoor Hospital, a secure psychiatric facility. After being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, his mental condition had deteriorated significantly during the trial and sentencing process, and prison medical authorities determined that he required psychiatric treatment rather than conventional imprisonment. His time at Broadmoor was marked by periods of relative stability, alternating with episodes of severe mental illness. The separation of the twins had profound psychological effects on both men. Their extraordinary closeness and mutual dependence, which had been sources of strength during their criminal careers, became sources of suffering and loss in prison. They were permitted limited contact through letters and occasional visits, but the intimate daily connection that had characterized their entire lives was permanently severed. Their imprisonment also had significant effects on their family members, particularly their mother, Violet, who remained devoted to her sons despite their crimes and continued to visit them regularly throughout their sentences. She maintained her belief that they had been treated unfairly by the justice system and continued to hope that they might eventually be released. The twins' legend continued to grow even after their imprisonment, as their story was retold in books, films, and television programs that often romanticized their criminal careers and celebrity status. These popular culture representations helped maintain public interest, in their story and contributed to their transformation from real criminals into fictional characters, whose true nature was often obscured by entertainment value. Their life sentences represented the final chapter in one of the most remarkable criminal careers in British history. The twins, who had once ruled London's underworld from positions of wealth and celebrity, were reduced to ordinary prisoners whose days were governed by institutional routines and whose futures were determined by parole boards and medical professionals. The trial and imprisonment of Ronald and Reginald Kray demonstrated both the eventual reach of justice and the ultimate futility of criminal enterprise. No matter how sophisticated or well protected, their transformation from celebrated criminals to imprisoned murderers served as a cautionary tale about the inevitable consequences of choosing violence and crime over legitimate achievement. The imprisonment of the Kray twins marked not the end of their story, but rather the beginning of their transformation from notorious criminals into cultural legends whose influence would extend far beyond their actual criminal careers. Behind bars, separated for the first time in their lives, both Ronald and Reginald would spend the next 3 decades grappling with the consequences of their choices while watching their reputations evolve in ways they could never have anticipated. Prison life proved to be a drastically different experience for each twin, reflecting both their distinct personalities and their divergent mental states. The separation, which prison authorities had deemed necessary for security reasons, was perhaps the cruelest punishment they could have devised for 2 men who had functioned as a single unit throughout their entire lives. Reginald's incarceration at Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight was marked by his attempts to maintain the dignity and respect that had been central to his identity throughout his criminal career. Even within the confines of Britain's most secure prison, he worked to establish himself as a figure of authority and influence among both inmates and staff. Parkhurst housed some of Britain's most dangerous criminals, and Reginald quickly recognized that survival and comfort within the prison system would require the same combination of strategic thinking and calculated intimidation that had served him well in the outside world. He cultivated relationships with other high-profile inmates, established informal networks for obtaining contraband and information, and positioned himself as a mediator in disputes between different factions within the prison population. His approach to prison life reflected his fundamentally rational and strategic nature. Rather than raging against his circumstances or attempting futile escape plans, Reginald focused on making his imprisonment as bearable as possible while maintaining hope for eventual release. He established routines that gave structure to his days, pursued educational opportunities that had been unavailable to him during his youth, and maintained extensive correspondence with supporters and admirers on the outside. The letters Reginald wrote and received during his imprisonment provided insights into both his psychological state and the continuing fascination that his story held for the British public. He received thousands of letters from admirers, many of them women who were attracted to his notoriety and the romanticized image of him that had been created by media coverage of his trial. These correspondences became an important source of emotional support and helped him maintain connections to the outside world that made his imprisonment more bearable. Reginald also used his prison time to reflect on his life and criminal career. Though his conclusions about his choices and their consequences remained largely self-serving, in interviews with journalists and biographers, he typically portrayed himself as a product of his environment, who had been forced into criminal activity by circumstances beyond his control. He rarely expressed genuine remorse for his crimes or acknowledged the suffering his actions had caused to victims and their families. His relationship with Frances continued to haunt him throughout his imprisonment. The guilt and grief he felt over her suicide remained intense, and he often spoke of her as the great love of his life, whose death had destroyed any chance he might have had for redemption. This narrative allowed him to present himself as a tragic figure whose criminal career had been driven by loss and despair, rather than by greed and ambition. Ronald's experience in Broadmoor Hospital was dramatically different from his twins' conventional imprisonment. The secure psychiatric facility housed individuals who had been found guilty of serious crimes, but who were deemed mentally ill and in need of treatment rather than punishment. Ronald's diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia meant that his daily life was governed by medical routines rather than prison discipline. The psychiatric treatment available at Broadmoor during the 1970s and 1980s was primitive by modern standards, relying heavily on powerful medications that controlled symptoms, but often had severe side effects that affected patients' quality of life and cognitive function. Ronald's medication regimen helped control his violent impulses and paranoid delusions, but left him often sluggish and disconnected from his surroundings. Despite his mental illness and the effects of his treatment, Ronald remained a formidable figure within Broadmoor, his reputation as a dangerous criminal and as unpredictable behavior made him someone that both staff and other patients treated with caution and respect. He formed relationships with other high-profile inmates and continued to believe that his fame and connections might eventually secure his release. Ronald's homosexuality, which had been carefully hidden during his criminal career, became more open during his time at Broadmoor. The institutional setting provided him with a degree of protection from the social consequences of his sexual orientation, and he formed several significant relationships with other patients and staff members. These relationships provided him with emotional support and companionship that helped him cope with his mental illness and separation from his twin. The correspondence between the twins during their imprisonment revealed the continuing strength of their bond. Despite their physical separation, they wrote to each other regularly, sharing news about their daily lives, their memories of their criminal careers, and their hopes for the future. These letters provided both men with emotional anchors that helped them maintain their identities and sense of purpose. Despite their dramatically changed circumstances, their letters also revealed their continuing inability to accept full responsibility for their actions or to understand the perspectives of their victims. They typically portrayed themselves as products of their environment, who had been unfairly persecuted by law enforcement agencies seeking high-profile convictions. This self-serving narrative helped them maintain their self-respect and sense of dignity, but prevented them from achieving genuine insight into the consequences of their choices. The twins' mother, Violet, remained a central figure in their lives throughout their imprisonment. She visited them regularly, maintained extensive correspondence, and worked tirelessly to publicize their cases and advocate for their release. Her unwavering loyalty and support provided both men with emotional sustenance and helped them maintain connections to the outside world. Violet's advocacy efforts included organizing petition campaigns, granting interviews to journalists, and maintaining relationships with politicians and other public figures who might be able to influence decisions about her son's imprisonment. She consistently portrayed them as devoted sons who had been led astray by bad influences and harsh circumstances, and she maintained that their sentences were excessive and unjust. Her dedication to her imprisoned sons was both touching and troubling. While her loyalty demonstrated the power of maternal love, it also reflected her inability to acknowledge the seriousness of their crimes or to understand the suffering they had caused to others. Her advocacy efforts sometimes hindered rather than helped their chances for release by reinforcing public perceptions of them as unrepentant criminals who had not accepted responsibility for their actions. The twins' celebrity status continued to grow during their imprisonment, fueled by a steady stream of books, articles, films, and television programs that kept their story in the public consciousness. Many of these productions romanticized their criminal careers and portrayed them as larger-than-life figures who had been unfairly persecuted by the establishment. The 1990 film The Krays, starring Derry and Martin Kemp, was particularly influential in shaping public perceptions of their story. The film presented a sympathetic portrayal of the twins that emphasized their devotion to their mother and their loyalty to each other while downplaying the brutality and consequences of their criminal activities. The movie's success contributed to a revival of interest in their story and helped establish them as cultural icons whose fame transcended their actual criminal careers. This continuing celebrity status had complex effects on the twins' prison experiences and their prospects for eventual release. On one hand, their fame helped ensure that their cases remained in the public eye, and that they received support from admirers who advocated for their release. On the other hand, their notoriety made it difficult for parole boards and prison officials to consider them for release without facing intense public scrutiny and potential criticism. The twins' approaches to maintaining their celebrity status differed significantly. Reginald was more strategic and calculated in his interactions with the media, carefully crafting his public image and controlling access to his story. He granted selective interviews to journalists and biographers, always presenting himself in the most favorable light possible and maintaining the mystique that had been central to his appeal. Ronald was more unpredictable in his media interactions, sometimes granting candid interviews that revealed aspects of his personality and criminal career that were inconsistent with his carefully constructed public image. His mental illness and medication sometimes affected his judgment and made it difficult for him to maintain the controlled persona that might have better served his interests. Throughout their imprisonment, both twins maintained hope for eventual release, though their chances were significantly limited by the nature of their crimes and the terms of their sentences. The minimum 30-year terms recommended by the sentencing judge meant that they would not even be eligible for parole consideration until they were in their mid-60s, and the serious nature of their crimes made it unlikely that parole would be granted easily. Their applications for parole, when they eventually became eligible, were complicated by several factors. The continuing public fascination with their story meant that any decision to release them would be subject to intense media scrutiny and public debate. Their failure to express genuine remorse for their crimes, or to demonstrate clear evidence of rehabilitation, made it difficult for parole boards to justify their release. Additionally, their continuing celebrity status and the romanticized portrayals of their criminal careers in popular culture raised concerns that their release might glamorize criminal behavior and encourage others to follow similar paths. Parole boards had to consider not just the twins' individual cases, but the broader social implications of releasing such high-profile criminals. The health problems that both twins developed during their imprisonment also affected their prospects for release and their quality of life within the prison system. Reginald suffered from various physical ailments related to his age and the stress of long-term imprisonment, while Ronald's mental illness continued to require ongoing treatment and monitoring. Ronald's death on March 17, 1995 at the age of 61 marked the end of one half of the most famous criminal partnership in British history. He died of a heart attack at Broadmoor Hospital, where he had spent the previous 27 years of his life. His death was front-page news in British newspapers and was covered extensively by television and radio programs that reflected on his life and criminal career. The funeral arrangements for Ronald became a media spectacle that demonstrated the continuing public fascination with the Kray legend. Despite being a convicted murderer who had died in psychiatric confinement, his funeral drew hundreds of mourners and was covered by television crews and newspaper photographers. The elaborate ceremony reflected both the twins' enduring celebrity status and their family's determination to maintain their dignity despite their criminal past. Reginald's reaction to his twins' death was devastating and marked the beginning of his own psychological decline. The loss of the brother who had been his constant companion and partner throughout his life left him emotionally shattered and apparently without purpose or hope. Friends and family members noticed a significant deterioration in his physical and mental condition following Ronald's death. Despite his grief, Reginald continued his efforts to secure parole and eventual release from prison. His applications emphasized his age, his health problems, and his separation from the criminal activities that had led to his imprisonment. He argued that he no longer posed a threat to public safety and that his continued Imprisonment served no useful purpose for either justice or rehabilitation. The debate surrounding Reginald's parole applications reflected broader questions about the purposes of imprisonment and the possibility of redemption for serious criminals. Supporters argued that he had served sufficient time for his crimes, and that his age and health problems made him unlikely to reoffend. Critics maintained that the severity of his crimes and his failure to express genuine remorse meant that he should remain imprisoned for the rest of his life. Reginald's eventual release on compassionate grounds in August 2000, just weeks before his death from bladder cancer, was controversial and attracted significant media attention. The decision to release him was based primarily on his terminal illness and the assessment that he posed no threat to public safety. But many observers questioned whether compassion should extend to convicted murderers, regardless of their circumstances. His brief period of freedom lasted only 36 days before his death on October 1, 2000 at the age of 66. Like his brother's funeral 5 years earlier, Reginald's funeral was a major media event that attracted hundreds of mourners and demonstrated the enduring fascination with the Kray legend. The deaths of both twins marked the end of their personal stories, but not the end of their cultural influence. Their legacy continued to grow through continued media coverage, new books and documentaries, and the ongoing fascination that their story held for new generations of admirers and critics. The broader impact of the Kray twins on British culture and criminal history extended far beyond their individual crimes and punishments. They had demonstrated how criminal organizations could evolve from simple street gangs into sophisticated business enterprises that operated at the intersection of legal and illegal activities. Their celebrity status had shown how media attention and public fascination could transform criminals into cultural icons whose influence extended far beyond their actual criminal careers. Their story also revealed the complex relationships between crime, celebrity, and social class in post-war Britain. The twins had risen from working-class poverty to become wealthy and famous figures who associated with celebrities and politicians, demonstrating both the opportunities and dangers that existed in a rapidly changing society. The law enforcement response to their organization had important implications for the development of modern police methods for dealing with organized crime. The investigation that led to their downfall had required new approaches to surveillance, witness protection, and evidence gathering that became models for future operations against sophisticated criminal organizations. The psychological aspects of their story, their extraordinary closeness, their shared identity, and their ultimate separation provided insights into the nature of criminal partnerships and the role that family relationships can play in both encouraging and limiting criminal behavior. Their relationship with their mother and their devotion to each other became central elements in the romanticized versions of their story that continued to circulate long after their deaths. The moral questions raised by their story about the nature of evil, the possibility of redemption, and the purposes of punishment continued to generate debate and discussion long after their deaths. Their crimes were undeniably serious and their victims deserving of justice, but their complex personalities and the circumstances that had shaped their lives made it difficult to dismiss them simply as monsters or psychopaths. The story of Ronald and Reginald Kray is ultimately a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. A tale of two men who possessed extraordinary abilities and opportunities, but whose fatal flaws led them inevitably toward destruction. Their rise from the poverty of 1930s East London to become the most notorious criminals in British history demonstrates both the possibilities and perils that exist when ambition, intelligence, and ruthlessness combine in individuals who choose to operate outside the boundaries of conventional society. Their criminal empire, built through a combination of violence, business acumen, and psychological manipulation, represented something unprecedented in British criminal history. They had transformed organized crime from crude street operations into sophisticated business enterprises that blurred the lines between legal and illegal activity. Their celebrity status had provided them with protection and influence that traditional criminals could never achieve, while their legitimate business interests had given them respectability and resources that enhanced their criminal capabilities. Yet their success contained the seeds of their own destruction. The very qualities that had enabled them to build their empire, their need for respect and recognition, their willingness to use extreme violence to maintain their position, their inability to accept challenges to their authority, ultimately drove them to actions that made their downfall inevitable. The murders of George Cornell and Jack McVitie were not aberrations or departures from their established patterns of behavior, but rather the logical culmination of a criminal career built on the premise that violence was an acceptable solution to any problem that threatened their position or reputation. These killings demonstrated that their sophisticated facade could not ultimately control or contain the fundamental brutality that was at the core of their criminal identity. Their psychological dependence on each other, which had been their greatest strength during their rise to power, became a source of vulnerability that their enemies could exploit and a limitation that prevented them from adapting to changing circumstances. Their inability to function as separate individuals made it impossible for them to develop the flexibility and independence that might have allowed them to survive the pressures that eventually destroyed their organization. The investigation and trial that led to their downfall revealed both the strengths and limitations of the British justice system in dealing with sophisticated, organized crime. Law enforcement agencies had struggled for years to build effective cases against the twins, partly because of their celebrity status and political connections, but primarily because of the fear and intimidation they had used to prevent witnesses from cooperating with authorities. The eventual success of Detective Superintendent Leonard Nipper Reed's investigation demonstrated that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations could be penetrated and destroyed if law enforcement agencies were willing to commit sufficient resources and expertise to the task. The methods developed during the Kray investigation became models for future operations against organized crime, showing how patient intelligence gathering and witness protection could overcome the traditional advantages that criminal organizations had enjoyed. Their trial and imprisonment marked not just their personal downfall, but the end of an era in British criminal history. The old-style criminal organizations that had dominated London's underworld for decades were replaced by new forms of criminal enterprise that were more international in scope, more specialized in their activities, and less dependent on local celebrity status for protection and influence. The transformation of the twins from living criminals into cultural legends began during their imprisonment and continued long after their deaths. The romanticized versions of their story that appeared in books, films, and television programs typically emphasize their charisma, their loyalty to family and friends, and their rise from poverty to wealth and fame, while downplaying or ignoring the suffering they had caused to their victims and the broader community. This romanticization reflected broader cultural ambivalence about crime and criminals in modern society. The twins' story appealed to audiences because it combined elements of social mobility, celebrity glamour, and rebellion against authority that resonated with people who felt constrained by conventional social expectations. Their criminal careers were seen as dramatic examples of individuals who had refused to accept the limitations imposed by their backgrounds and circumstances. However, this romanticized version of their story obscured the reality of their criminal activities and their impact on the communities where they operated. Their protection rackets had imposed financial burdens on legitimate businesses. Their violence had traumatized victims and witnesses, and their corruption of public officials had undermined the integrity of democratic institutions, the victims of their crimes. Both the individuals they had murdered and the broader community that had suffered from their activities were often forgotten in the popular culture representations of their story. George Cornell and Jack McVitie became footnotes in a narrative that focused on the twins' personalities and relationships rather than on the consequences of their actions for the people whose lives they had destroyed. The continuing fascination with their story reflected deeper questions about the nature of power, success, and morality in modern society, their ability to achieve wealth, fame, and influence through criminal activities challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between virtue and reward, suggesting that society's moral foundations might be less stable than many people preferred to believe. Their celebrity status during their criminal careers had demonstrated how media attention and public fascination could provide protection and legitimacy to individuals whose activities were fundamentally antisocial and destructive. This lesson had broader implications for understanding how criminal organizations might exploit modern media and celebrity culture to advance their interests and protect themselves from law enforcement pressure. The psychological dimensions of their story, their extraordinary closeness, their shared criminal identity, and their ultimate separation provided insights into the nature of criminal partnerships and the role that family relationships can play in both encouraging and limiting criminal behavior. Their relationship demonstrated both the power of loyalty and mutual support and the dangers that can arise when these positive qualities are directed toward destructive ends. Their deaths marked the end of their personal stories, but not the end of their influence on British culture and criminal history. Their legacy continued through the ongoing fascination with their story, the law enforcement methods that had been developed to combat their organization, and the lessons their careers provided about the nature of organized crime and its relationship to legitimate society. The moral questions raised by their story remain unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. They were undoubtedly guilty of serious crimes that caused real suffering to real people. But they were also complex individuals whose lives had been shaped by circumstances and influences that had predisposed them toward criminal behavior. The question of whether they could have chosen different paths, or whether their criminal careers were inevitable consequences of their personalities and backgrounds, continues to generate debate and discussion. Their story serves as both a cautionary tale about the ultimate futility of criminal enterprise and a fascinating example of how individuals can rise from humble circumstances to achieve remarkable success through intelligence, ambition, and determination, even when those qualities are directed toward illegal and destructive ends. The price they paid for their brief period of power and celebrity was enormous. 30 years of imprisonment, separation from each other and their family, the destruction of everything they had built, and ultimately their deaths in captivity, far from the East End streets where they had once been kings. Their story reminds us that even the most successful criminal enterprises must eventually face the consequences of their actions, and that the apparent glamour and excitement of criminal life cannot ultimately compensate for the human costs it inevitably exacts. Yet their legend endures, testimony to the continuing human fascination with individuals who dare to challenge conventional boundaries and pursue their ambitions without regard for social expectations or moral limitations. Ronald and Reginald Kray achieved a form of immortality through their crimes, their celebrity, and their ultimate destruction. A legacy that ensures their names will be remembered long after the details of their actual criminal activities have been forgotten. In the shadows of 1960s London, two names struck fear into the hearts of both criminals and civilians alike. But in the end, the shadows claimed them both, leaving behind only memories, legends, and the eternal question of what might have been if they had chosen different paths. Through the maze of possibilities that life had offered them, their story reminds us that even the most powerful empires built on fear must eventually crumble, that celebrity cannot ultimately protect us from the consequences of our choices, and that the price of power when that power is built on violence and intimidation, is always higher than it first appears. The legend of the Kray Twins continues to fascinate because it represents the eternal human struggle between ambition and morality, between the desire for power and the need for connection, between the appeal of rebellion and the necessity of social order. Their names have become synonymous with a particular time and place in British history. But their story speaks to universal themes that transcend their specific circumstances and continue to resonate with new generations of readers and viewers. In the end, Ronald and Reginald Kray were neither the romantic heroes that some popular culture representations suggest, nor the simple monsters that their critics sometimes portrayed them to be. They were complex, contradictory individuals whose extraordinary abilities were directed toward destructive ends, whose success was built on the suffering of others, and whose ultimate failure was as inevitable as it was tragic. Their story serves as a reminder that the choices we make define not only our own destinies, but also our impact on the lives of others, and that the pursuit of power and recognition, when divorced from moral considerations and human compassion, leads ultimately not to triumph but to tragedy. Not to lasting success, but to inevitable destruction. What did you think of this story? Which aspect fascinated you most? If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Britain's most notorious criminal stories, there are many more tales waiting to be told. Subscribe for more sleepy crime stories that will take you on journeys through history's most captivating criminal minds. Like this video if it kept you engaged for the full story, and share it with fellow true crime enthusiasts who appreciate stories told with depth and atmosphere. The story of the Kray Twins reminds us that even the most powerful empire built on fear must eventually crumble, and that the line between legend and tragedy is often thinner than we imagine. Until next time, rest well. And thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of London's criminal past.